Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I am Basma Alawi, and I am the National Campaign Manager for We Are All America, a national campaign that works to uphold and strengthen our nation's commitment to welcome and protect those seeking freedom, safety, and refuge in the United States. We organize people across religious and cultural differences to build inclusive communities where we all belong. I want to start first by starting with a greeting to my Jewish brothers and sisters who observe the Yom Kippur holiday, and I pray and wish you easy fasting. We will be recording today's webinar to make sure everyone who missed will have access to it after, and you can find it all at the We Are All America YouTube. Today's webinar is not only timely, but personal to me. I am a former refugee from Iraq myself, and someone who arrived in the United States with a special immigrant visa or an SIV. For the past month, seeing the images on the news in Afghanistan, watching as people desperately worry for their family separated back home, brings me back to my experience as a refugee. It is hard to disconnect when I was in a similar position not that long ago. Every day, I face former refugees and Afghans who are terrified of their future to come. Yet each morning, even in the midst of a crisis, xenophobia and Islamophobia exist. We Are All America has been organizing in the past month our communities nationally and at the state level, and making sure since day one that our work is led by the impacted people and centering the voices of our Afghan brothers and sisters. And we have been leveraging our network of immigrants' rights groups to welcome Afghan refugees. Today's conversation is so important, and I'm grateful for all the speakers and organizations who have worked to pull this together, including National Partnership for New Americans, Cities for Citizenship, Cities for Action, Welcoming America, Refugee Council USA, and the Refugee Advocacy Lab. We also want to acknowledge Welcoming.us, a new campaign that launched this week, which will expand the capacities to welcome Afghan refugees. We look forward to continue collaborating with this campaign. Today's webinar will provide an update on Afghan arrivals, how localities and welcoming refugees, and go deeper into the newly released toolkit, tips to build and sustain a locally welcoming infrastructure that shares ways cities and counties have been taking actions. Today's webinar will be moderated by Farhat Gopal, Immigrants Affairs Manager, City of San Diego, California. We will have time for questions after the presentation, and the recording and slides will be shared following the webinar. Farhat, I will turn it now to you.
Thank you so much, Basma, and thank you for your empathy and your solidarity. Welcome, everyone, and thank you all for joining today. I wanted to take a minute to set the scene a bit, so I appreciate you indulging me. Imagine for a minute that you are a woman working for the city of Kabul, Afghanistan, as a public servant on August 15th. Maybe your husband works for the Afghan military, or he was an interpreter with international troops, and you have a young son. By the following day and in the ensuing weeks, you lose your job because the new government doesn't believe that women should be public servants. Your husband's name is on a hit list, and there's evidence of torture and kidnapping of people on those lists. You're running out of money because the banks are closed or limited in capacity. You can no longer go outside on your own, and there's now a long list of other rights and freedoms that have been taken away from you overnight. None of your neighboring countries will give you a visa, and you're essentially a sitting duck until the Taliban find you and your family. What do? This isn't every Afghan story, but it's the story of some of the thousands who will be seeking refuge in the US and arriving in our communities. And the common theme among all of them is that they've lost everything they worked for the last 20 years, not just as individuals, but as an entire country. That trauma and loss is immense, and they'll need all the support that we can give them in this moment. In San Diego, we've had a lot of community interest in supporting Afghan refugees and many Afghan American community members and those outside the community collecting donations and collating other types of support. At the city level, we're in touch with our local refugee resettlement agencies and other community-based organizations on what arrivals might look like, what the challenges and needs are, and how best we can support, excuse me. We're also in touch with the county and the state, and we're trying to emphasize the welcoming message that we as San Diegans welcome Afghans as new neighbors and as part of our region and our community. With that introduction, I'd like to introduce Kristen Astor, Director of Client and Community Engagement at the International Rescue Committee. Kristen, over to you.
Thanks so much, Farhat. Can you go to the next slide, please? Next slide. Next one. Great, thank you so much. So my name is Kristen. I'm with the International Rescue Committee. We're one of the 9 national refugee resettlement agencies, and I appreciate everyone's interest and time today. So I'm going to set the stage a little bit and then talk about the current situation. So just as a reminder, the current transfer of power from the former Afghan government is compounding a decades-long humanitarian and protection crisis that has left more than 18 million people in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. There are over 3 million Afghans internally displaced, with over 500,000 displaced this year alone. And even before the recent escalation in conflict, Afghanistan has produced the 2nd largest number of refugees in the world, and the latest situation has caused thousands of people to attempt to leave the country. Next slide. So the United States has welcomed Afghans in need of permanent resettlement for several years. Since federal fiscal year 2001, the U.S. has resettled over 20,000 refugees from Afghanistan to locations around the country. And additionally, since FY 2008, the U.S. has admitted more than 75,000 Afghan special immigrant visa recipients and their families, the top 5 states being California, Texas, Maryland, Virginia, and Washington. This last federal fiscal year alone, FY 20, 11,421 SIV recipients and their families arrived primarily from Afghanistan. Next slide. So, as a reminder, a refugee is someone who has a well-founded fear of persecution based on race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group. The SIV program is available to Afghan nationals who are employed by, on or behalf of the U.S. government within Afghanistan. And this program is intended to allow those who qualify and their direct family members to apply directly for admission to the U.S. The Priority 2 Refugee Program is a designation that this is a group of special concern to the U.S. government. And the new P2 designation for Afghanistan expands beyond the SIV program to include those who didn't meet the minimum time and service requirement for the SIV program, as well as those who worked in Afghanistan for a US-based media company or a non-governmental organization. And this group was created on August 2nd. So you can see similar aims, but 2 different pathways. Next slide. So in FY 20, as I mentioned, there were a little over 11,000 SIV recipients from Afghanistan who arrived. Nationally, there were 21,000 refugees and SIV recipients who arrived, with a little over a half being SIVs. So as you can see, we've been resettling folks from Afghanistan for a long time, and the majority of arrivals last year were from Afghanistan. Next slide. So briefly about the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program for those who might be less familiar. So every year, the president sets, after consultation with Congress, the refugee admissions goal for the following year. And this has been the system since the Refugee Act of 1980. Next slide. So refugees go through extensive vetting from numerous government agencies, national security databases, biometric checks, in-person interviews, and all of this can take 2-3 years, even longer at times. Next slide. So there are 9 national refugee resettlement agencies, so that once folks are approved by the US government to be resettled, they are then assigned to one of the 9 agencies that then place refugees and SIV recipients around the country. Next slide. And as you can see, there are over 200 sites around the country where refugees and SIV recipients resettle. I do want to note that SIV recipients don't count towards the annual refugee admissions cap, but they're both served by the refugee resettlement agencies and receive the same services. Next slide. So the two primary federal agencies that provide funding for refugee resettlement services are the Department of State and the Department of Health and Human Services. So the Bureau of Population, Refugees and Migration within the Department of State funds services for the first 30 to 90 days. And the refugee resettlement agencies help refugees and SIV recipients find housing, do cultural orientation, medical screenings, all of the initial work to help folks get integrated in their new communities. And then there are benefits and services offered through the Office of Refugee Resettlement within Health and Human Services for up to 5 years. Next slide. And as you can see, this is just an example of the variety of services that refugee resettlement agencies, in conjunction with our community partners, provide to arriving refugees and SIV recipients. Next slide. So I wanted to focus the last few minutes on the current situation. So in July and August, the US government undertook large-scale transportation of vulnerable Afghans, including those who worked alongside the US, out of Afghanistan to help them safely resettle in the United States. There is historical precedent for efforts such as these. So for example, in 1975, after the Vietnam War, and then in 1996, after the first Iraq War, the US used its parole authority to transport thousands of refugees and US allies to Guam and Wake Island, where they went through vetting protocols and immigration processing before being resettled to mainland US. Next slide. So Afghans assisted in their departure from Afghanistan first spent time on a US government facility in a third country, including Bahrain, Germany, and other countries, where initial processing and security vetting by the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Defense, the State Department, the FBI, and many other federal agencies occurs. They are then transported to the United States, where they temporarily stay on one of a set of government facilities to undergo medical screenings and immigration paperwork. Upon completion of these processes, they are assigned to a refugee resettlement agency to go to a final destination to receive initial support services. And the final location will vary based on whether they have a US tie, such as a US family member, and available services and resources to serve the family. There are also some individuals who may arrive on their own to locations of their choosing in the US. Next slide. So as folks are arriving, the folks who are currently coming are being granted humanitarian parole. Humanitarian parole is a temporary form of protection that offers employment authorization. Afghans arriving to the United States are currently being granted parole for 2 years. Next slide. So once Afghans arrive at their final destination, they will receive an initial set of support services to help them begin their new lives. This will include services such as assistance finding temporary and permanent housing, basic needs such as initial clothes and furnishings, assistance accessing healthcare and other services as applicable, assistance enrolling in school for school-aged children, cultural orientation, and legal assistance to help them apply for adjustment of status. But it's really important to note that at this time, Afghan parolees are generally not eligible for the longer-term benefits and services that resettlement refugees and SIVs are eligible for that I mentioned earlier, making private and community support, including the support of all of you on the line today, particularly critical. There are efforts in Congress to pursue solutions to these challenges so that all Afghans will be able to access the federal benefits and services under the refugee program, as well as to facilitate their adjustment to lawful permanent resident status. And we'll be providing information at the end with links to those efforts, as well as some fact sheets from the Department of Homeland Security about the program. But in the meantime, and regardless, these arrivals will need support from state and local partners and community support, which has really been outpouring from everyone around the country. Go to the last slide. So as was mentioned earlier, there are already so many wonderful efforts to really harness the incredible community support we've seen around the country. The Welcome.us platform, which launched this week, and we'll make sure folks have a link to that. I also wanted to share the Refugee Council USA Afghanistan response page. So we'll be sharing that as well. But just to say, you can access more information in these sources, and also they offer other avenues to be able to channel your support. So with that, I think I actually ended a few seconds early. So I'm going to turn it back over to Farhat for our next panelist.
Thank you so much, Kristen. That was a really helpful overview. For those on the line, please put your questions in the Q&A box. We'll go ahead and take those towards the end. Now I'd like to introduce Amy Eusebio, Executive Director of the Office of Immigrant Affairs for the City of Philadelphia. Amy, over to you.
Thanks, Farhat. So hello, everyone. I'm Amy Eusebio in Philadelphia. And I just really want to thank Cities for Action, Cities for Citizenship, and PNA for allowing me to share some of our experience in Philadelphia in welcoming Afghan evacuees. As the daughter of immigrants myself, I'm humbled to do this work and really proud of our mayor, Mayor Jim Kenney, and my colleagues across the administration for really prioritizing our role as a welcoming city and centering dignity, compassion, and humanity in our recent operations. So for those who have had the chance to review the toolkit that had been shared about strategies for welcoming, I'm going to be really focusing today on messages of welcome, as well as touching briefly on multi-sector responses. So we can go on to the next slide. Yep, there you go. So as part of messages of welcome, here are some of the things that we prioritize in our city. So first off, Mayor Kenney, he put out statements of support from the beginning, even before we were beginning to receive folks in our airport. So brief pause to say, for those who do not know, Philadelphia is one of 2 receiving airports right now of the flights leaving third countries and receiving Afghan evacuees. Over the last several weeks, we've received near 12,000 people in our airport. And so a lot of what I'm going to focus on is some of what we've been doing in the airport operations. And so even before we began receiving people in our airport, Mayor Kenney put out a statement of support on social media. He also signed on to the Global Migration Compact letter of support, which is part of an international community. And then our Office of Immigrant Affairs partnered with our local refugee resettlement agencies on a solidarity event with our local Afghan community. And then we were alerted that we were to begin receiving flights. And so we're humbled by the opportunity to really demonstrate what it means to be a welcoming city and to put that into action, right? And beyond words of solidarity. And there are a few unique elements of our operation that I wanted to share for consideration for folks. First off, in our airport operations, we had a medical triage, which was unique to the operation. It was led by our acting health commissioner, Dr. Cheryl Bedigal, who spent a portion of her career addressing healthcare needs of migrant workers. And so she was tunely aware of the needs of immigrant communities. She knew that these would be long flights. People may be arriving with chronic conditions, no medication. And so we stood up a medical triage that once folks cleared customs and arrived in Philadelphia, cleared customs, they would go through medical triage right there in our airport. And so it was originally staffed by our health center staff, so city employees, and eventually we were able to tap into local resources with the area universities and hospitals, and as well as contracted medical staffing companies as well. It's been a really key component of the success of our operation because we've had very little emergency transports to the hospital because we've been able to capture a lot of those health conditions and just really, again, just greet people with warmth. Interpreters, it goes without saying, but sometimes you must say that interpretation is of critical importance. My colleagues through the Office of Emergency Management, through the Health Department, all identified that this is not going to work without appropriate language support. Our Office of Immigrant Affairs, we manage the City of Philadelphia contracts for language services and quickly notified our contracted vendors that we were going to be receiving people, that we were going to need Dari and Pashto interpreters specifically, and they didn't have enough interpreters. And so as we alerted them to the need, they began recruitment. They began deploying people to our airport. And then we also stood up a parallel process, recruiting community members and clinicians as volunteer interpreters. We have an infrastructure here in Pennsylvania, our Medical Reserve Corps. We were able to direct people to get registered and vetted through that process. So we had a pipeline to be able to receive volunteers and manage volunteers. But then separately from that, where I think there's an opportunity for economic development in our immigrant communities is interpretation as a career pipeline. So many community members who were wanting to help but are in need of employment opportunities, right? Other Afghan arrivals who've been coming, over the years, this became a real opportunity for employment for folks. So many of our local vendors were able to orient and onboard pretty quickly for people to receive skills in interpretation and provide that support. Because again, we scaled up very quickly to support our airport operation. However, there's going to be a need for interpretation in the years to come as we're receiving, larger volumes of folks from Afghanistan. Additional areas that I want to highlight as part of messages of welcoming as well is we engaged in early community engagement with our local refugee resettlement agencies, spiritual leaders, and leaders within our Afghan community here in Philadelphia. And so they helped identify areas for prioritization in our welcoming, which included being mindful of spirituality and spiritual practices. And so we were able to designate a prayer space, and that's the image that you see here on this slide. We were able to work with our colleagues in the Office of Emergency Management to designate a prayer space with, as you can see, prayer rugs and then Mecca clearly identified too. So like that folks had that available to them if they wanted to use it. A lot of people did. We're really pleased to see that. My supervisor, Joanna Otero Cruz, who's the Deputy Managing Director of Community Services, also led coordination in interfaith communities in order to engage our local imams in supporting the prayer space and attending to people's spiritual needs. And we were able to have a couple of imams support Friday Juma for folks to, again, be seen and welcomed within our city. And then lastly, in messages of welcoming, I want to highlight halal meals. It's been a real point of conversation. It's been a really great opportunity for educating different folks within the administration on, how to be supportive of folks as they are arriving. Again, long flights, people are hungry. There are a lot of families, a lot of children. So we had worked with our state agencies and contracted vendors to ensure that meals are indeed halal. Again, educating folks that it's not just about not being pork products, but also the preparation and storage is equally as important in the process. So that's been really neat to be able to have our interpreters be part of that process and community members too, to share feedback and for government to be responsive and quickly adjust to the feedback that we were receiving. And so beyond the airport operation, just touching really briefly on multi-sector response, we can go on to the next slide. So here are a couple of the things I've been spending a lot of time on the airport operation and the crisis response required there, but already several multi-sector response elements have bubbled to the surface, and I just want to kind of share a smattering of that with you all today. So again, quickly, we partnered with refugee resettlement agencies to identify areas where our local systems needed to be prepared and strengthened for the arriving evacuees. So first off, even before we received people in the airport, they had identified that housing, and I see that question just popped up in the chat too, they had less time for resettlement. So normally they get 10 days notice when a family is to arrive, and they were beginning to see like 1 or 2 days notice. So one quick thing we did was organizing area hotel managers to recruit them as partners with us, to offer discounted rooms that can be booked within 24 hours and would be accessible to the refugee resettlement agencies when they receive notification of a family being resettled in our region. In general, lack of affordable housing is a real problem for us here in Philadelphia. And so even pre this current crisis, we were had been inspired by some work from our colleagues in Pittsburgh and are hosting a webinar next week, actually, as part of our Welcoming Week programs to recruit more landlords as partners for the refugee resettlement agencies. Another area of concern, donations, coordination, and management. So because we were managing an emergency operation in the airport, we did not have capacity to manage a donations process. And so we touched base with our local partners, again, refugee resettlement agencies, other nonprofits, to find out what their capacity was to receive and coordinate donations and redirect that, that energy for giving in a different way, in a productive way. I think a lot of times people are wanting to be helpful, but don't know how to be helpful. So it's important for the city to be a partner with local agencies in order to put out the proper directions for donations. And then a couple more areas before I wrap up. School district engagement is very important. So they've been a member of our rapid response group here locally, letting them know that, we are receiving many large families with small children. So think about that in your own local coordination efforts. And then I think also just identifying areas for advocacy. As was already mentioned, parolee status is a different status. And so I just see the opportunities for concern for how people might, lose status or be in precarious situations and have additional needs. And so where are there areas for us as cities to come together and advocate on behalf of this community? And so I'll wrap up by saying, it really just has been a huge learning experience for us here in Philadelphia over these last 3 to 4 weeks. But we're here for it. Again, because being a welcoming city, again, a lot of us say that we are, but I think these are the moments where like the rubber hits the road, and how do we actually show up and do welcoming, right, as a practice. And so, these are a brief elements that I shared today, but happy to answer additional questions at the appropriate time later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amy. You absolutely exemplify what it means to welcome with dignity. So thank you for all of your work in Philadelphia. Next, I'd like to introduce Tino Gallegos, Immigration Liaison, and Ann Hemke, Faith-Based Liaison for the City of San Antonio. Over to you both.
Thank you, Farhad. And I just want to thank you for the invitation to speak today. I want to thank our mayor, Mayor Ron Nirenberg, and council for their messages of welcoming and for signing on to the compact as the mayor of Philadelphia has done. I'm Tino Gallegos, the Immigration Liaison for the City of San Antonio, and I am here with my colleague, Ann Hemke. Can we get the next slide, please? And she is the Faith-Based Liaison for the City of San Antonio. And we're going to talk to you really particularly about the multi-sector response here at the City of San Antonio. And Ann is going to talk to you about some of our prior experiences and our values and how it is that we do multi-sector work to address humanitarian aid kinds of programs and other kinds of projects and initiatives here in the City of San Antonio. And I'll talk to you about our particular response for the Afghan evacuees. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ann. Go ahead, Ann.
Thanks, Tino. Next slide, please. And before I even get into this slide, I really have to thank Amy and everyone else, but Amy has just given me like a double checklist, right? I was writing down the list. I'm like, yep, got to check that, double check, 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 check. So that's really a great example too of how we work in San Antonio, but I'm also strongly coming to believe that that's how we work across the United States. And I'm really grateful and proud of that. How this collaboration has come together is not new for us. It comes out of our experience. And the first thing that I want to say is that San Antonio literally was birthed out of the intersection between faith and society. And so the faith community has always been active, trying to figure out always, like exactly how to do that, but always active when the need comes forward. And it really does inform our values. And along with those values of compassion, collaboration, co-laboring together, and commitment to community, we really kind of have always stepped up together. And then we keep learning from those experiences. And I just really feel like we were positioned at this time to move as efficiently and effectively as we have because of our prior experiences. I would be surprised to find out if others didn't know that we take a lot of hurricane evacuees. When that happens, we're good at it. We have fine-tuned that system of welcome and helping people find the things that they need to be resettled or go back, to have things rebuilt. But we've also found equally how people do want to help, but unless things are somewhat organized, they start to make it up. And the making up of help can sometimes be more of a problem, a difficulty, than just actually coming together and trying to figure out who does what. So we do have this long history of the faith community working with the community at large and civic leaders. We have this history of welcoming hurricane evacuees. 2 years ago, the migrant surge that happened in 2019, I couldn't have been prouder of our city manager when it literally just kind of hit us. And he said, we're welcoming people because it's the right thing to do. This is what we do. These are our neighbors. And so bringing that whole, the work to the level of recognizing the dignity of all humanity and respecting that. And frankly, we did a lot of scrambling during that one, but we also did a lot of work, learned a lot, got really organized. A lot of volunteers came forward. And we still have a lot of folks migrating through here, but we learn a lot and we keep fine tuning by coming together. Another element I see that Tino's put here are Pathways to Hope. It's an annual conference that we've been holding for about 6 years, but it's on mental health and specifically the engagement of community and who all is in community, which is all of us. So we have been for a good half a dozen years. I feel like we've been preparing for the final wave of COVID for 6 years, building community here to be helpful, aware, co-labored, working together to address that need of the rising mental health concerns there. We're officially a compassionate city, along with about 450 other cities around the planet, but we're also Military City USA. We're a welcoming city. All of this kind of just makes our equation and how we've worked in the past a perfect equation to welcome our new neighbors. So next slide. And so I mentioned that we've already learned a lot, but these are some of the things we've learned and then some of the things we bring up as we form every new collaboration that we have in the city. But we try to match the energy of the community. Yesterday, we got word from somebody who's like, I can be a translator, where do I go, right? So to take that kind of energy and then put that towards the obvious need that we have right now. And I really appreciated Amy's whole comment about that being a source of employment as well. So I wrote that one down. It's also obviously so that one organization doesn't carry the entire load. We look at things for efficiency and effectiveness. We look for duplication and we look for gaps. We try to fill those gaps because everyone, people just show up and say, we want to help. And then it really makes it easier in that collaboration for the people on the ground who are providing that direct service and for those families. I already said it avoids those donation depths because people do just start making things up. But within our current collaboration, one of the things that we noticed was a small gap, but a gap of that kind of long-term community companionship, what we're calling community sponsorship, which isn't a new term, but really calling forth within the faith community to companion and develop long-term forever relationships to help people get settled here. So Tina, why don't you tell everybody more about how we've done that?
I will. Thank you, Anne. Next slide, please. So the way that our response, the way that it came about was really because we had a lot of different people talking to us about this particular need. It really started with our refugee resettlement and refugee serving organizations. We have two federally funded refugee resettlement organizations in San Antonio, Catholic Charities and Raíces. And we have one nonprofit that serves refugees who are no longer eligible for refugee resettlement programs, and that's the Center for Refugee Services. They came to us pretty early on, the beginning of August, and told us what they were starting to see and telling us that we really needed to find a way to start addressing these concerns and supporting them. And we also started to get calls when the news really started to pick up the story of the rapid fall of the Afghan government and the fall of Kabul. We started to get a lot of calls from community organizations, from faith communities, from churches, from mosques and other organizations saying that they wanted to help newly arriving Afghans. And people knew that we would have Afghans arriving because we already have had many SIVs resettled here to San Antonio over the past few years. In fact, they're the largest numbers of resettled refugees in the last few years have actually been SIVs from Afghanistan. So we have a small but growing community and a lot of concern. And as Anne mentioned, we have this other kind of designation as being a military city, as being a city that supports military and veterans, and also a compassionate place. So the community came and they approached us, and also we had businesses and corporations asking how they could help. So what we did was we brought people together just to kind of talk through it, right? We wanted to hear from our refugee serving organizations and have them tell us what they needed, what was going to be an appropriate response, what would not be helpful, and we had questions from the community and from these other people who wanted to help, who were already proposing how they could help. And so we tried to match them up. One of the things that we decided to do was to come up with a website that was specific to San Antonio, where we could access this information quickly, and we developed that at afghansinsa.org. And so the idea behind afghansinsa.org, and I'll show you the page here in a moment, is just to gather all of those resources in one place for San Antonio, for people to visit there and find ways that they can connect. And once we have people making those offers or wanting to interact with our refugee serving organizations or our community members, they then can be routed towards the appropriate places. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to show you just a snapshot of some of our partners. We have about 28 partners that have joined in with this effort, and they really run the full spectrum of organizations here in San Antonio. We have like our large nonprofits that traditionally serve the community, like the food bank. We also have sacred.org. We'll talk about them in a moment. Our three refugee serving organizations, and some different affinity organizations and faith-based organizations that are all part of this collaboration. Next slide, please. I want to highlight a couple of the key roles that some of these nonprofits play. The food bank, I think as Amy mentioned, the importance of donations management. The food bank has been really great here in San Antonio as far as handling donations management for these kinds of initiatives and projects. In the migrant support area, we've depended on them a lot to receive donations, and they've agreed to do the same for this for the Afghan evacuee initiatives. They're going to receive the donations for us, they store them and sort them, and then help distribute them back out to the places where they're needed. So this is a really big key component, because a couple of our refugee serving organizations mentioned to us that this was a gap that they could not fill on their own. They didn't have enough space to actually store all the donations they anticipated receiving. Our refugee serving agencies provide us, again, with the expertise. They provide us with the snapshots on the ground. They can tell us about the rapidly changing landscape that is the Afghan evacuee experience right now. And so that they're really key partners, because they can also help us channel, again, like Ann mentioned, those donations and those volunteer efforts to the right places. sacrd.org, otherwise known as sacred.org, is a San Antonio resource directory that captures really like all of the different resources that are available in San Antonio to help people. Many of these resources are not listed on the directories because they're so small. So sacred.org, what they've done for us is they've actually built the website and they provide all the tech support. So this was a donation from them to this project, and they are continuing to help us find the tech solutions that will help connect the volunteer and the donation energy to the appropriate people who need them. And finally, Interfaith San Antonio has been convening the faith communities and has taken the lead on the community sponsorship piece that Ann mentioned. I think we'll maybe have a chance to talk about it in a little bit. Next slide, please. So just to give you a quick overview of what Afghans in SA looks like, it's based on the Refugee Council USA website for Afghans. So it's 4 different buckets: volunteers, donations, resources and advocacy, and community sponsorship. And it is a way for people just to very easily find a way to plug in. And we are building it out. So I encourage you to visit it, afghansinsa.org. Give us some feedback and let us know how we're doing and how we can add some additional resources and advocacy. And if we do have a little bit of time, maybe Ann can talk to us about the community sponsorship part. Next slide.
I'm wondering too how much time we have. I haven't been following that, but our community sponsorships, as I mentioned earlier, are long-term. They're being coordinated within our interfaith community, which we have a long history of doing that. These sponsorships, we can also think about it in terms of companioning, because it's really built on relationship and getting people to know the family, but also then the family getting to know San Antonio, how to go shopping in one of our grocery stores that are as big as the state of Texas itself. How do you do that, but kids in school, and how to, maybe help find work if they're having difficulty with that, but also recognizing within the orientation and trainings that we're doing, the reciprocity that's built into it, that learning happens both directions, that cultural sharing, it only makes San Antonio stronger and richer in who we are, because we're already a very large city with many cultures in the mix. So it really builds as well on the secular ethic of reciprocity, that to treat others and welcome others the way we would wish to be welcomed, especially if the table were turned. So we keep that in mind in how we do these partnerships and sponsoring. But it's really that part from moving from housing to homing. So, getting people settled, but how do they make home here? I remember the first time I met Tino, we were both hired shortly apart. But when we sat down, he was like, how do you park downtown? It's that kind of relationship. How do you figure out those little things that make things feel more comfortable, make San Antonio feel more like home to somebody? And so that's what these sponsorships are going to be built on. So next slide, please. And Tino probably won't, go way overboard on this one. So I'm going to, I doubt if we have time to watch this now, but I encourage you to write this down. This is an incredible, we have some amazing poets in San Antonio, which I'm sure all of you do. But this welcoming poem was written by 2 of our local poets. It's about 5 minutes long, and it's beautiful. I don't know, Tino, if you want to say any more about that, because this was your idea and you made it happen.
Yeah, it was a project that we did for World Refugee Day, and I really think that just it's like the anthem for my office. So if you have 5 minutes and you just you need to center yourself, relax, remember why you do this, take a minute and listen to the poem, and you will be inspired. Thank you.
And transported to the Riverwalk in San Antonio. That's where it is. Be transported.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tino and Anne. That is a great note to end on. And we'll go ahead and move over to audience Q&A. I know there's quite a few questions in the chat, so we've tried to kind of group them as needed. First question is both for Amy and Tino. How did your local government finance this response?
I'm happy to start off in saying we are fully expecting to be reimbursed by the federal government and been having those conversations with them. So we're tracking our expenses. We're fronting the expenses because it's the moral thing to do. That's exactly what the mayor said.
Can I just add that we've had a lot of migrants come through San Antonio since 2019. There was some FEMA funding that was made available for reimbursement under the EFSP program, the Emergency Food and Shelter Program. I always forget what the acronym stands for. But it was $30 million for 2019, and then they passed some new money in ARPA for 2021. That is I think it's 118 million. So there is always a possibility of specific reimbursement. And one thing done with the EFSP this time around, which has been helpful, is that they're doing the reimbursement on a quarterly basis. So it does make it a lot easier to front the cost because you know you'll get the money back sooner. But I don't know if it's available for this effort.
Thank you so much. Next question, what recommended actions do you have for cities where they won't be directly receiving families and likely a handful will settle outside of formal city boundaries? And maybe Basma, could you take that one?
Thank you, Farhad. I think we have shared actually the toolkit for the tips, how people really could get connected. But I think now it's really important for people to share the message. As we said in the beginning, narrative is really important at this time. Xenophobia and Islamophobia are ongoing, happening, and we want to make sure the message is clear, that we do have a responsibility to welcome these communities. So one, share the message, follow the work of the campaign of welcome.us, follow the work of this amazing organization who was in the call, because they will keep you informed in the work that they are doing in your cities or outside your cities.
Thank you so much. The next question we have is related to housing. Can someone speak to that and sort of how you've handled resettlement in areas with very high housing costs?
I can take that. I think, like we've heard from some of our incredible city partners, particularly as folks who are arriving, fairly quickly, and it's a shorter time frame, as Amy talked about, than we usually have. Temporary housing solutions have been really critical. So as Amy, Tino, and others talked about, having those hotel partnerships has been immensely valuable. So we so appreciate the hotels that have stepped up to help with them in those partnerships. Airbnb.org has been a wonderful national partner that's enabled private spaces, and folks who are interested in being an Airbnb.org host can sign up for that. There's information on that in the welcome.us platform as well. And there have been other creative housing partnerships. I heard of one area where the municipal government had looked at a hotel that they had purchased during COVID for other uses, and using that hotel as a temporary housing space for arriving Afghans, as an example. So in some areas, just having those temporary housing solutions have been a really critical interim step. And then the refugee resettlement agencies have worked for years to create relationships with landlords and property management companies, because of course affordable housing is an issue we all face across the United States. Refugees come in with, they don't have employment history, credit history, right? So there's some education and relationship building that takes place. And so again, just to say, if any of you on the line, either personally or know of property management landlord partners, that would also be immensely valuable to this effort as we transition folks from temporary to permanent housing. And again, to add that the Refugee Resettlement Program is focused on self-sufficiency. And so there is an immense effort quickly to get folks employed to be able to support themselves and their families and to have wages that will be able to fund housing in those higher housing markets. And I think this relates to a question earlier about employment authorization. The Afghan parolees are eligible for employment authorization. And so again, having those employer partners to really leverage the amazing skills that folks are bringing will be really key. So I hope that answers a little bit, that there's a few components, having those temporary housing partnerships, developing those longer term permanent housing partnerships, and then working with folks to access jobs that help them support their families. So those are some initial responses from my side, but if anyone else on the line wants to add in, feel free.
Yeah, what additional detail I wanted to add is I think probably many of the municipalities here might be part of the Welcoming America network as well. And I know that just last week there was a webinar featuring Pittsburgh's program to increase the available landlord capacity and property manager capacity in region. So there's some concrete things that were shared there that might be really helpful for folks to check out.
Thank you both. I think there's also been some follow-up questions around what funding cities are potentially using to help with the housing costs. I know I saw some reference to ARPA funds, but I don't know if that would qualify here. If any of our speakers have additional details on that.
I can chime in to just make clear too, because I know that this was also a question about the hotels. So the role that the city of Philadelphia has been playing is more so convening partners and creating opportunities, not actually paying for the housing resources. So the refugee resettlement agencies do receive federal funds for their resettlement work. And so they're paying for people's housing costs. As for the hoteling, the emergency, that temp solution, I don't believe that's currently an eligible expense as part of the federal dollars, but I know our local folks are looking to fundraise for that, and we as a city would support their fundraising efforts. So I really love the, my colleagues Tino and Ann shared that, there were things that I shared that inspired them, but their website inspires me, and that way of being able to solicit those donations and then direct accordingly, I think becomes an opportunity.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Amy.
Can I quick add to that?
Of course.
I just realized something. There's another thing that we do in San Antonio. And when you said that about the website, it's called an urgent action auto alert. So it's on your phone, and maybe you have some of those already for whatever reason through your cities. But we have one that's specifically for human care and services. And so we're able through that auto texting system, which is free to anybody, to opt in and opt out. But we point people specifically to specific places with specific needs, with a specific name and phone number. And, when we need something like right now, we send that out. So if we need children's car seats, all sizes, all brand new, that's about how much we say and where they're supposed to take them. And if they have any questions, they can call this person. So if you don't have that, I really encourage you to get that.
Thank you, Ann.
Thank you.
Kristen, would you be able to talk a little bit about the workforce opportunities you've been able to create for refugees as translators or interpreters or otherwise?
Yeah, for sure. So as I mentioned earlier, finding and sustaining employment is a primary focus of the services that we work with refugees to provide, and these folks that contribute immensely to our communities. As I mentioned earlier, we have a large Afghan diaspora here in the United States. Those folks have been arriving for many years. And for all refugees and SIV recipients, report after report just shows how much folks contribute to our economy, and how we're so fortunate to glean from the skills and experiences that folks are bringing. So just to say that we work with an array of employer partners to help folks find employment. And as the question references, many folks are arriving served as interpreters and translators overseas, and so have that strong English background already. And even with the current response, there's an immense need for interpreters as well. So just to say, there are many opportunities for folks to be employed with the current response, and then in the longer term, we work with folks to access employment both immediately and then as well to find pathways for additional employment, particularly as folks come in with higher degrees, et cetera, and looking for pathways for folks to be able to recertify or find future pathways for employment as well. So that's a brief snapshot of some of the things that we do.
Perfect, thank you. Several people have asked for ESL resources and other ways to directly help refugee families locally. Do you all have recommendations for resources out there, both for individuals, faith groups, and small organizations who may want to help directly in their communities?
I think it's really varied from a city to another city, but I can just step in and share here what's happening in our city here in Jacksonville, Florida. We have main Afghan mosque that have been really, we are trying to center them to lead the effort and support them with any kind of resources. And they have been the ones who providing interpretation and support within ESOL or even supporting kids with tutoring. So I think it varies from city to another city. Seems like some cities have been sharing resources, but for us, it's really have been with the community support.
And I can add to that. I think I've already said some of that in what we presented, but we too are supporting those faith traditions that are, obviously needed at this time, but it's really a multi-faith effort that then they provide kind of that lead of what's really needed. And the rest of the interfaith community, they're going, okay, we'll get that done. The Church of the Latter-day Saints, I mean, they're just going like crazy right now and helping, to get apartments outfitted and, like whatever is needed. We have a really large Catholic community here as well. And of course, Catholic Charities is here and one of the direct services in this regard. And so, we just have a really long history. And as she mentioned, every city is going to be different, but we have a long history of the faith community working together to meet, those most basic human needs and the spiritual needs, but stepping up to do so. And
maybe just the last question for all of our panelists is there anything else that you'd like to add? Anything we may have missed or that's important for folks to be aware of as we all prepare to welcome Afghan refugees?
I'll just say that just wanted to emphasize that we do anticipate this being a long-term partnership. So I know we're all partnering together and addressing these immediate needs, but I think these networks that are being established, these relationships will be so critical for the long term. So we really look forward to working with all of you. I know there are many networks represented today, and there's so many creative ideas you heard about today and that I'm hearing about all over the country that I think we all can continue to stay in touch and generate and share these ideas together. Amy, I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to add.
Yeah, and I'd say, as a municipal employee, I think it's really important for us as cities to listen. So wherever possible, to host a listening session within your communities. If you haven't already been meeting with your local refugee resettlement agencies or refugee serving organizations, just convene a meeting and listen to them. A lot of what we implemented at the airport very quickly came from feedback that we got from community. We listened and we tried to implement it all, as quickly as possible. And my colleagues in San Antonio, it sounded like they did a very similar thing of like hearing what people were identifying as their own needs.
I can just add one thing quickly. I was surprised, and maybe I shouldn't be, that there were so many people from all the different parts of the political spectrum, and especially veterans groups and people that were in the military or military serving organizations who were very interested in assisting with this. So it is a little bit different. We've had some other experiences, with people who are arriving from the southern border, and that generates a lot of other different kinds of controversy sometimes. But I found that this experience is a lot different. And so, you may be able to find partnerships in places that are kind of unexpected, where you wouldn't have before if you've been working in immigration spaces for a while. So just keep an open mind to that.
Thank you so much to all of you for your incredible hard work to welcome with dignity and compassion and humanity in every way possible. And thank you for sharing your experiences with all of us. Just a reminder for the audience, please know that Localities Toolkit is out there. Please take a look for ways that you can do some of this work. And a reminder to continue to check back on welcome.us for all of the great efforts and ways to engage locally on that website as well. Thank you very much for your time, everyone. Thank you for joining today.